Imagine this. You used to have opinions about everything. You laughed louder. You called your friends without even thinking twice. You wore clothes because you liked them. You ordered what you wanted at restaurants without scanning the table to first see what everyone else was having. Now, before you speak, you wonder, how is someone else going to react to this? Before you make a decision, you think about how to keep the peace. And somewhere along the way, you stopped asking, what do I want? And started asking, what will make everyone else okay? If any of this feels familiar, today's episode is for you. Because today we're talking about something that often happens so gradually we don't even notice it happening. How we slowly lose ourselves.
Welcome to Nerdy Psychology. Break it down with a little curiosity. Don't be curious, stay kind. Keep your mind nerdy.
Hi, psychology nerds. I'm Dr. Angel, and this is Nerdy Psychology, a place where we take the complicated, tender, very human parts of being a person and make them a little easier to understand without judgment and without pretending that healing is simple. Last week, we explored why it's so difficult to leave unhealthy relationships. The slot machine, the intermittent hope, the trauma bonds, and the mechanisms that can keep us tethered to something that's hurting us. If you haven't watched that one yet, I'll link it because today's episode sits just a little earlier in that same emotional landscape. Today, we're asking a quieter question, one that deserves compassion, not blame, not why is it so hard to leave, but how do we slowly become someone we no longer recognize? Sometimes long before we ever realized we're allowed to ask for what we want. The day you realize something is missing. Here's where I want to start, and I want to start carefully because language matters. Most people don't walk into my office and say, I'm unhappy. That's not usually the sentence. The sentence is quieter, honestly, more unsettling. Things like, I miss myself. One of the saddest parts about losing yourself is that it usually doesn't happen because you decided you weren't important. It happens because over time, everyone else's needs simply just became louder than your own. And one day you wake up realizing you know exactly what everyone else wants, but you honestly couldn't tell someone what it is that you want. Think about how strange that sentence actually is. Missing a person implies, well, distance, implies that somewhere that person still exists, just out of reach. And that's exactly what it feels like. Not I'm broken, just I'm somewhere else. And I'm not entirely sure how I got here. People rarely notice the first compromise. Nobody remembers that exact day that they stopped painting or stopped going for their Saturday morning hikes or stopped calling their sister just to talk or stopped laughing the way they used to at their own jokes or stopped speaking up in a room full of people who disagreed with them. What people notice, what finally makes them stop and say something out loud, is the accumulation, the gap between who they were and who they become once it's grown so wide to see it enough. Losing yourself rarely feels dramatic while it's happening. Actually, it feels gradual, almost reasonable, one decision at a time. And that's exactly what makes it so hard to catch. I want to ask you something, and I would like for you to actually sit with it for a second before you keep watching. When was the last time you did something simply because you enjoyed it? Not because someone else expected it of you, not because it keeps the peace in the room, but just because you felt like it. Hold on to whatever came up for you. We're going to go back to that. The psychology of small compromises. I want to introduce a metaphor that I think about often because I've never found a clearer way to actually explain what's happening here. I call it The dimmer switch. A room doesn't suddenly just go dark. Nobody flips a switch and plunges you into blackness. Instead, slowly turns down the dimmer switch, one notch, then another. And here's the part that matters most because it happens so gradually. You never actually notice the room getting darker. You only notice one day that you're struggling to see. That's identity. Nobody loses themselves overnight. The light just slowly gets turned down. And I want to be precise about something because this metaphor could sound like it's describing something that someone else does to you, like a villain in a story that's dimming your lights on purpose. Sometimes that's true, but far more often, both people in the relationships are turning down the dimmer together. One small request, one small accommodation at a time, without either person fully realizing what's been happening. Because no one ever actually asks, would you like to lose your identity today? Nobody would ever say yes to that question. Instead, it sounds more like this: oh, it's just easier if we don't go. Let's not make a big deal out of it. I'll just let it go. I don't care where we eat. I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm fine. And eventually, I'm gone. Here's something I've noticed sitting across from people for many years. They rarely say, I lost myself. What they say, almost word for word, over and over from people who have never met each other is, I don't know why, but I don't feel like myself anymore. And that sentence always catches my attention because it means the light is still on somewhere in there. It's just been dimmed so slowly over so long that they can no longer tell you exactly when or how or by how much. Why our brains do this. Okay, I want to say something clearly because I think it changes how the rest of this episode lands. This isn't pathology. It's not a flaw in your character, and it's not evidence that you're weak willed or easily controlled. Humans are wired for belonging, for acceptance, for attachment, for reducing conflict. We naturally adapt to our environment, and that instinct has kept our ancestors alive in tribes where being cast out meant real danger. In healthy doses, it's one of the most beautiful things about being a human. The problem isn't adaptation. The problem is when adaptation quietly becomes self-abandonment. Let's look at the mechanisms underneath this because once you see them, they lose some of the power over you. One, accommodation. Every healthy relationship requires, well, some flexibility. Compromise is not the enemy here, but there's a meaningful difference between healthy accommodation and what happens in unhealthy dynamics. One requires flexibility and the other requires, well, disappearance. Flexibility just means you exist, still with some give, but disappearance means there's less and less and less of you to give. Two, people pleasing. I want to reframe something for you. People pleasing is not a personality trait, and it's not a character flaw you were simply born with. It's a survival strategy, one that likely worked at some point in your life to keep you safe or keep you connected or keep you feeling loved. The problem isn't that the strategy existed. The problem is when it never got the memo that the danger has finally passed. Three, chronic stress and a response most people have never heard of. You've probably heard of fight, flight, and freeze, but there's a fourth response that gets far less attention. And I think it deserves more. It's called fawning. Fawning is what happens when your nervous system decides that the safest response to conflict or threat isn't to fight or to run from it, but to appease it, to smooth it over, to make yourself smaller and easier to be around, to prioritize someone else's emotional state over your own emotion needs. It's a beautiful, tragic kind of intelligence, honestly. Your body found a way to keep you safe. It just never learned that safety and self erasure aren't actually the same thing. For identity drift, this is a concept I want to draw a very specific line around because it's different from what most people picture when they hear Identity crisis. A crisis is sudden, it's loud. Identity drift, that's the opposite. Small changes, repeated so many times in such small increments that no single one of them ever feels significant enough to notice, let alone resist. I want to give you one more way to picture this because I think it might be the one that might help stay with you. I like to call it the backpack. Every compromise adds one rock, just one. And well, one rock doesn't feel heavy. You can carry a single rock around all day without even thinking about it. But 50 rocks? Now that changes how you walk. It changes your posture, your pace, how you feel tired by the end of the day, just doing ordinary things. No single compromise stole your identity. The accumulation of them did. Signs that you may be losing yourself. I don't want to give you a list of red flags today. Red flags point outward at someone else's behavior. What I want to give you instead are internal signs, quiet signals that live inside of you, regardless of what anyone else is doing around you. When you find yourself, you apologize automatically, sometimes before you even know what you're even apologizing for. You don't know your favorite restaurant anymore. And not because you don't have one, but because it's been so long since anyone's asked. You wait for permission before you do things that never used to require, well, any permission. You over explain simple decisions as if you owe a defense for wanting what you want. You don't fully trust your own preferences anymore. You second guess them before you even finished having them. You feel guilty relaxing, like rest is something you have to earn. And sometimes, quietly, you look at your old photos of yourself and you don't recognize the person inside them. Not because you look different, but because something behind the eyes looks different. And here's the question I'd like you to sit with, the same way we did earlier. If someone who loved you 5 years ago met today's version of you, what would they notice first? Finding your way back. I want this to feel like exactly what it is, hopeful, because I'm not going to tell you to leave anything or burn anything down or make a dramatic announcement to everyone in your life. What I want to talk about is smaller, quieter, and far more sustainable than that. Return, not reinvention. Return. Here are 5 tools. 1, practice tiny preferences. Choose a dinner, choose the music in the car, choose the shirt because you like it, not because it's easy. These decisions almost feel embarrassingly small. And that's exactly the point. You're exercising a voice, the same way you'd exercise your muscles that have gone quiet in disguise. Small reps, repeated, build strength. 2, reconnect with old parts of yourself, old hobbies, old friends, old dreams you quietly shelved somewhere along the way. Ask yourself, what did I love before I became responsible for everyone else's emotions? That question alone tends to surface things people have forgotten they ever cared about. 3, journal, but with the right prompts, not how was my day. Try these 2 instead. When do I feel most like myself? And when do I feel the smallest? Track your answers over a few weeks. Patterns tend to surface faster than people even expect, and they're often more specific and more actionable than I just feel off. 4, spend time with people who remember who you've always been. There is something quietly powerful about being in a room with someone who knew you before the dimmer switch started turning. They often see that light still on long before you can see it in yourself. 5, redefine what selfishness actually means. Choosing yourself is not the same as abandoning the people you love. And I'm going to say that again. Choosing yourself is not the same as abandoning the people you love. It's remember that you exist too, as a full person with preferences and needs, not just a role that you perform for everyone else's comfort. I'm going to tell you a story about Priya. Priya did not have a dramatic turning point. There was no single blow up, no door slam, no big goodbye. But what she had instead was a Tuesday, an ordinary Tuesday, months and months into small, unglamorous work, choosing her own dinner, calling an old friend she let drift, going back to a pottery class because she used to love it in her 20s. And that Tuesday, something happened during dinner with that old friend that made her laugh, like really laugh, the loud, unfiltered kind she used to be known for. And she stopped mid laugh, genuinely startled by the sound of her own voice. And she said, I haven't heard myself laugh like that in years. Small, real, in its own quiet way, enormous. So let's bring the dimmer switch back one more time. Maybe you don't need to become someone new. Maybe you simply need to turn the lights back up, piece by piece, choice by choice, conversation by conversation, until one day you catch yourself laughing, really laughing, and you realize, I'm still here. You were never completely lost. You were simply quieter than you deserve to be. And the beautiful thing about quiet lights is that they can always be turned back up. If today's episode brought up that quiet ache of missing a version of yourself, I built my workbook, Your Next Chapter, with exactly this kind of rediscovery in mind. It's a guided space for the work we talked about today, practicing small preferences, reconnecting with who you were before the dimmer switch started turning, and slowly finding your way back to yourself, one honest page at a time. If you're interested, you'll find it linked in the description below. If you feel comfortable, I invite you to leave a comment. What's one part of yourself you would like to reconnect with? And I thought this would be a great time for me to share a little bit of a personal story. One of the activities that I decided to reconnect back with myself is in roller skating. I used to enjoy and love and have a passion for roller skating when I was in my teens and 20s, and life happened and I didn't roller skate anymore. And so I decided, well, I was going to give it a whirl. And you know what? I'm not as good as I was back then. But what I can tell you is that it has just stirred up a piece of me that feels so amazing. And every time I put my little roller skates on and roller skate at the little roller skating rink, it is my happy place. It is my space and my zone. These aren't just theories that we talk about in this episode. These are things that I'm practicing too, right alongside of you. If this episode felt like it was speaking directly to you, I would love it if you would, well, like and subscribe if you haven't already, and share this with someone who might be quietly missing themselves too. If today's conversation resonated with you, I think you'll really enjoy my episode, Why You Love Like This, Understanding Attachment Styles, because it explores where, well, many of these patterns begin. Long before we learn how to lose ourselves in relationships, we're learning what relationships are supposed to feel like. And understanding those early experiences can help explain why, well, some patterns feel so familiar and how we can begin creating healthier patterns. And as always, be curious, stay kind, and keep your mind nerdy. See you Friday. That's a wrap.
Be curious, stay kind, keep your mind nerdy.